All right, today we are diving into one of the most sprawling, chaotic, and honestly most important conflicts in all of European history, the Hundred Years' War. This isn't just a story about battles. It's an epic saga about contested crowns, new ways of fighting, and the painful birth of two nations we know so well today, England and France. Let's get into it.
So the first thing you see is the name, right? The Hundred Years' War. And you have to ask, how could a war possibly last for 116 years? Well, the surprising answer is, it didn't. Not in the way we think of war today. This wasn't non-stop, continuous fighting for over a century. It was actually a series of brutal, intense conflicts with long, uneasy truces in between. It was a generational struggle that spanned 5 different kings on each side, with the fighting flaring up whenever one side saw a weakness in the other.
So where did this all kick off? Well, the war's beginning was really a perfect storm. You had a dynastic crisis, a fight over who should be king, smashing right into long-standing arguments about land and power. It was all about who had the right to rule what was then the wealthiest kingdom in Western Europe.
See, for centuries, the French royal family, the Capetians, had this incredible streak of luck. They always had a son to inherit the throne, an unbroken line. But in 1328, that chain finally broke. King Charles IV died without a son, and suddenly, this massive power vacuum opened up. The richest throne in Europe was up for grabs.
And this brings us to our two main contenders. Over on the left, you've got England's King Edward III. Now, by blood, he had a really strong claim. He was the direct nephew of the dead French king. But, and this is a huge but, his claim came through his mother. So on the right, you have the French nobility. They were not exactly thrilled about the idea of an English king, so they picked their own guy, Philip of Valois, a cousin of the late king.
So how did the French justify skipping over the guy with the closer blood tie? They got creative. They dusted off this old legal code called Salic law and basically said, hey, look, this ancient law says the crown can't be passed down through a woman. It was a pretty convenient way to block Edward's claim and ensure a Frenchman, their guy, Philip VI, got the crown.
But this whole fight wasn't just about who got to wear the crown. There was this other incredibly awkward problem that had been simmering for years. The King of England owned a lot of valuable land in France, particularly Gascony. And for that land, he was technically a vassal, meaning he had to pay homage to the King of France. Can you just imagine that? A powerful king having to kneel before another king. It was a constant source of tension, and in 1337, Philip used it as an excuse to try and confiscate Edward's lands. And that was the final spark. The war was officially on.
All right, so now we get into the first phase of the war. And let me tell you, England came out swinging. They unleashed a military campaign that just shocked the continent and brought the mighty Kingdom of France to its knees.
The English victories were just staggering, one after another. First, at sea, they absolutely smashed the French fleet at the Battle of Sluis, giving them control of the English Channel. Then, on land, at Crécy and later Poitiers, their secret weapon, the English longbow, was just devastating. These waves of arrows completely shredded the charges of France's heavily armored knights. It was a total game changer. And then, at Poitiers, the unthinkable happened. The King of France himself was captured right there on the battlefield.
Just look at that number. 3 million gold crowns. To get their king back, the English demanded a ransom that was so enormous it was clearly designed to bankrupt and humiliate the entire French kingdom. It really just highlights what an absolute catastrophe this war had become for France.
You'd think things couldn't get worse for France after those defeats, but they did. The country was pushed to the absolute edge of collapse. We're talking a nightmare combination of plague, civil war, and just when it seemed like rock bottom, another massive English invasion.
On top of the military disasters, you had a biological one. The Black Death swept across Europe, and it hit France incredibly hard. When you combine the plague with the constant destruction from the war, historians estimate that the kingdom lost half its population. Half. The country was literally hollowed out.
This quote here from a chronicler who was living through it, it gives you this really raw sense of the total chaos. With the king captured and the government in shambles, the whole kingdom just descended into anarchy. The social fabric was tearing apart, France was collapsing from the inside.
And who decided to step into this chaos? Well, a new, ambitious English king, Henry V. He saw France was weakened and torn apart by civil war between its own nobles, and he decided it was the perfect time to go in for the kill. He invaded, and at the now legendary Battle of Agincourt,
his massively outnumbered army won another unbelievable victory, once again wiping out a huge portion of the French nobility.
This all led to the Treaty of Troyes, which really represents the lowest point for France in the entire war. Henry V married the French king's daughter, and the treaty stated that their son would become the heir to both England and France. The actual French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was declared illegitimate and totally disinherited. It looked like it was over. England had finally won the 100 Years' War.
But, and this is one of the biggest buts in history, things are rarely that simple. Just when the French cause seemed completely and utterly hopeless, the war took its most dramatic, most unexpected turn imaginable.
Just when all hope seemed lost, from the heart of a broken and defeated France, an unlikely savior emerged.
I mean, her story is the stuff of legend. Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl, comes forward saying she has divine visions telling her to save France. And incredibly, people believe her. She galvanizes the totally demoralized French army. She didn't just win battles, she completely shattered the myth of English invincibility that had haunted France for decades. Her victory at the Siege of Orleans was the crucial turning point, and it led directly to the coronation of the rightful king, Charles VII. And even though she was later captured and executed, she had already done the impossible. She gave France back its will to fight.
Building on this incredible new momentum that Joan had created, the newly crowned King Charles VII started to completely overhaul France's entire approach to war. He was about to change the game entirely.
And you can see the fundamental shift right here. On the left, that's the old way, feudal armies, where nobles showed up with their men, served for a little while, and had their own agendas. But on the right, that's the future. Charles created one of the first professional permanent armies in Europe. These were paid soldiers, loyal only to the king. This gave him a reliable, disciplined fighting force that the English feudal army just couldn't compete with in the long run.
And it wasn't just about the soldiers. The French backed up this new army with new technology. They invested heavily in artillery and became masters of the cannon. All of a sudden, those English-held stone castles that could have held out for a year under a normal siege could now be smashed into rubble in just a few days. Gunpowder was literally redrawing the map of France.
So now you have this powerful combination, a professional army and cannons that could knock down any wall. It proved unstoppable. The French began systematically rolling back all the English gains, taking back towns and castles one by one. The final, decisive battle at Castillon in 1453 was a huge French victory, and it effectively crushed England's long-held dream of a continental empire for good.
So, after 116 years of bloodshed, what was the result of it all? Well, the legacy of this war was absolutely profound. It fundamentally reshaped both England and France for centuries to come.
Let's just quickly break down these consequences. First, and maybe most importantly, this constant conflict created a real sense of national identity. People started thinking of themselves as English or French in a way they never had before. For England, losing its French lands was a turning point. It forced the kingdom to become the island nation we think of today, looking to the sea for its future. The war also completely changed how armies were fought, pushing out the old feudal knights and bringing in professional soldiers and gunpowder. And the fallout in England? The shock of the loss, the huge cost, and all those unemployed soldiers coming home, while that explosive mix helped ignite their own brutal civil conflict, the Wars of the Roses.
Which brings us to our final question. Did this 116-year war actually create modern France and England? When you look at the consequences, it's hard to argue against it. It seems that out of more than a century of fire, blood, and chaos, the very foundations of these two great nations were forged. This medieval struggle didn't just define an era, it set them both on the path to the future.